Society itself is a balancing act between personal liberty and civic duty. It seems that if we wish to maintain our prosperity and standard of living, some sacrifices need to be made in the form of taxes, fines, and public services. Throughout history, many thinkers have pondered the question, what is the optimal balance and how can we achieve this? The system we'll be going over today was laid out by Thomas More in 1516. In it, we are given a theoretical explanation for how a system in which private property and currency are abolished would function. This would lay the groundwork for what would come to be known as communism in the 1840s. The text is formatted as a dialogue between More, his friend Peter Giles, and a well-traveled merchant who recounts the island nation of Utopia, Raphael Hythloday, whose name translates as dispenser of nonsense in case you were worried More was a commie. The first section we'll go over is a conversation recalled by Raphael, where he was speaking with an English cardinal and his posse of yes-men. The cardinal was proudly boasting about how readily they hang petty offenders, particularly thieves, then expressing his confusion as to why this brutal consequence seemed to have minimal effect on the willingness of perpetrators. Raphael, of course, takes issue with this approach, saying it's both too severe and quite ineffective as a deterrent, suggesting instead that they tackle the root cause of the issue. Elaborating on this, he gives us various examples of the ways in which commoners are driven to theft for survival, starting with the wounded soldier returning home unable to continue his former trade and too old to learn a new one. The only skill that remains is that of violence, so he utilizes this to acquire the resources for survival. The second is the retainer. Once the noble they serve dies or they themselves fall ill, they are discarded and without means of providing. The third he describes the farmer forced from his land, so that it may be added to that of a noble's sheep enterprise, which was a big problem in England at the time, similar to how industrial farms artificially control prices today, swallowing up smaller family-owned operations. In each of these, he characterizes the upperclassmen as lazy and discontent, describing them as greedy individuals that prey on their native land like a malignant growth, absorbing field after field and enclosing thousands of acres with a single fence. He then provides what he believes to be the ideal alternative, a region in Persia where criminals are utilized as slaves, owned not by individuals, but to society as a whole. Throughout the book, you'll see that More's solution to a lot of things is slavery. I attribute this to be a solution to two fundamental roadblocks in the sort of society he tries to depict. The first is the volume of menial but necessary tasks needed for high society to exist. In one where citizens live an ideal and fulfilling life, they should be exempt from this sort of thing, necessitating the creation of a lower, less esteemed class to do all their dirty work. Secondly, he acknowledges that human nature cannot be entirely snuffed out by legislation, and you need some way to justify not executing every criminal offender, so slavery. The island nation of Utopia is a sort of fat crescent, with its broadest length being about 200 miles from shore to shore. The tips of the crescent form a strait about 11 miles wide, with a harbor filled with rocks and shoals, making it unnavigable unless you're familiar. The island was originally a peninsula, however, 1700 years before the events of the book, it was conquered by a guy named Utopos, who had them dig a trench 15 miles wide, separating it from the mainland. 54 large, basically identical towns are spread across the island, with a minimum of 24 miles between each. Every town is surrounded by a thick, high wall encumbered by a moat. The houses are all 3 stories tall with a 20-foot wide street separating the facades of each. In the backyards, there are gardens. At regular, unknown intervals throughout the countryside, there are houses large enough for 40 workers, supplied with agricultural equipment. The town dwellers serve a mandatory 2-year farming obligation that they can apply to extend if they favor the lifestyle, which many do. They're responsible for cultivating the soil, raising livestock, and felling timber. Any tools or equipment they may need are provided by the town. When harvest time comes, they tell the bench eater how many additional people they need and he conscripts them. The whole ordeal is usually done in less than 24 hours, though. Households must contain between 10 and 16 members and are separated into groups of 30. These elect a steward, and for every 10 stewards, there is an overseeing bench eater. There are about 200 stewards per town which are responsible for electing the mayor. This gives us a rough estimate of about 78,000 people per town, times 54 towns equals roughly 4.2 million people in the whole of Utopia, about the same as modern-day Panama. Nobody is allowed to campaign for office, and if they do, they're barred for life for the election. Besides farming, everyone, including the women, are taught a trade. The job of the stewards is to make sure everyone is working. This is usually the one practiced by their parents. However, if they desire to learn a different one, they can be adopted into another family. The day consists of 3 hours of work in the morning, followed by lunch, and then a 2 hour break. Then another 3 hours of working, then dinner, and then bedtime by 8 p.m. The rest of the time, they're free to do as they please, so long as what they please is deemed to be constructive. Many of them spend this time attending free lectures, which are required for those deemed intellectually gifted, but more still just get extra work done on their trade. How can a 6 hour workday be conducive to such prosperity, you may ask? Well, compared to most nations where a minority of men are functionally employed, Utopia operates on the principle that every able-bodied person, without exception, will contribute to the labor force in the fashion deemed most necessary. This means that they always have a surplus. Having no use for it themselves, they export it in exchange for either iron, which is the only raw material they import, or precious metals to be added to the war treasury. During wartime, Utopian citizens rarely ever see combat. Instead, they hire mercenary forces to combat their opponent before they ever reach the island. Social posturing is seen as dishonorable. Everyone wears the same clothes, and the only people adorned in gold are the slaves in the form of chains and shackles. Thus, when foreign diplomats came to Air Castle for a mission, they were mistaken for slaves adorned in flimsy, ornamental gold chains. When a citizen suffers either a debilitating injury or old age, they are given the choice of being executed, which most opt for, as not to burden their fellow countrymen, though, if they wish, they are free to continue to be cared for until they succumb to their ailment. Due to its central location, the de facto capital of Utopia is Air Castle. This is where Parliament meets and most diplomatic missions are conducted. Besides this, it's identical to every other town in both layout and social framework. One aspect of this version that would be done away with in later revisions of communism is freedom of religion. Priests are elected directly by the citizens. Their responsibilities include educating the children, reprimands for moral shortcomings, praying for both sides during battle, and holding celebrations during certain holidays. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close it out by reciting a prayer that the Utopians often cite. O God, I acknowledge Thee to be my Creator, my Governor, and the source of all good things. I thank Thee for all Thy blessings, but especially for letting me live in the happiest possible society and practice what I hope is the truest religion. If I am wrong, and if some other religion or social system would be better and more acceptable to Thee, I pray Thee in Thy goodness to let me know it, for I am ready to follow wherever Thou shalt lead me. But if our system is indeed the best, and my religion the truest, then keep me faithful to both of them, and bring the rest of humanity to adopt the same way of life and the same religious faith, unless the present variety of creeds is part of Thy inscrutable purpose. Grant me an easy death when Thou takest me to Thyself. I do not presume to suggest whether it should be late or soon, but if it is Thy will, I would much rather come to Thee by a most painful death than be kept too long away from Thee by the most pleasant of earthly lives. Thank you for watching.